I'll start by seeking refuge in God from the curse of Satan, and I'll welcome all the Muslims here with Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And I'll welcome all the Christians as well that are here and thank the organisers for hosting this event with a hearty welcome, and I genuinely hope that at least so far there's been something interesting for you, and hopefully I'll be able to follow that along, and that may be the continuing theme of the evening. So I'm going to be talking about, first of all, what we say about the Qur'an and then what the evidence says about the Qur'an. I think we've kind of probably started our presentation somewhat similarly. And then secondly, I'll be looking at the New Testament more exclusively. Certainly the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures is by far more my field of expertise, but I hardly really thought it would be extremely relevant for a room of predominantly Christians to listen to Old Testament textual criticism. So I'll be focusing on the Qur'an and the New Testament, and perhaps during the rebuttal period I might head to referencing some of the Old Testament a little bit. So what do we say about the Qur'an? Well, essentially, we say that it was a book revealed to the Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel, roughly about 1400 years ago. I'll just get the summary up for you. Over a period of 23 years in Mecca and Medina, which are towns or now cities in modern-day Saudi Arabia. It certainly wasn't Saudi Arabia back then, and was basically just a land of varying tribal groups. There was certainly no single political or cultural identity other than really the speaking of Arabic and some, fundamental cultural norms that were sort of followed amongst the tribes. So we also believe that the Qur'an was revealed in what's called 7 ahruf. Okay, the singular of that word, harf, essentially means words or particles. Okay, now it might be a bit difficult to sort of get your head around coming from, I guess, an English New Testament sort of perspective, knowing that all of the New Testament basically comes in one language, in Greek. And indeed, we're saying that the Qur'an was only revealed in Arabic, but at the time, because of the differences between the tribes, there were a few dialectual differences. And we believe that the Qur'an was revealed in all of those different dialects. Okay? In terms of the exact nature of the difference, we don't really speculate. We now know, or we believe, that the Qur'an we have now is united onto one harf, or one dialect, and that's what we're going to be focusing on from here on in. Certainly, as Samuel quoted, the Prophet, peace be upon him, instructed that the Qur'an be written down during his lifetime. Now, it wasn't written down on paper, it wasn't written down on a book, simply because paper didn't really exist at the time. There were things like vellum, writing on bone, that sort of stuff, but writing down on paper and certainly having a bound book was not really an option, particularly given the desert climate. Okay, as Samuel also summarised, we believe essentially that Abu Bakr, who was the first Caliph, or the first president after Muhammad, peace be upon him, then collected the Qur'an again. And we believe that the reason for this is because a range of reciters and those that had memorised the Qur'an were dying, not just due to old age, but also in battles and the conflicts that were going on in the early Muslim period. And so in order to ensure that the Qur'an could be sustained in what we consider to be tawattur, or a perfect manner, or a certain manner, Abu Bakr had to ensure that there were at least 2 witnesses for every Qur'anic verse. Okay? And that's certainly a Qur'anic injunction, that for any fact to be established, there must be 2 witnesses. So basically Abu Bakr was trying to follow the Qur'anic injunction of having 2 witnesses. Moving on, we believe that later on, Uthman, who was the second after Abu Bakr for the Islamic presidency, so to speak, also asked for the Qur'an to be united, but this time onto one dialect. Okay? And there were 2 reasons for that. One, because Islam had spread beyond the Arab lands, there were non-Arabs that were combining dialects, different dialects, in reciting. And this, first of all, had the potential to change the meaning. But secondly, as the Arabic written language was starting to develop, people were spelling words differently. Okay, they were spelling words differently. And so because of that, it was important that the text was united onto not only one dialect, but also one mode of spelling. Right, so we'll move on from there. What do the academics say about the Qur'an? Well, very quickly, there's only a few options available for them to sort of stick to. The first one is that our account is more or less correct. Obviously, the non-Muslim academics aren't going to agree that the Qur'an has a divine origin coming from God, but they may say that our account is more or less correct, that it just comes from Muhammad or some other Arab at the time. Okay? The other option is that our tradition isn't exactly correct and that there were later additions, say 100 years or so after the death of Muhammad. Another option is that the Qur'an didn't exist in its current form until about 300 or 400 years after Muhammad. And then the final option is that the Qur'an was actually written in Syriac. Now, the last two options, I've underlined them because they've recently been disproven absolutely. So, as an individual in the audience, you can prescribe to one of the first two options, basically. Otherwise, you're going to be flying in the face of non-Muslim academics. And what is the academic evidence? Well, first of all, I'll say that there is strong academic evidence to support what we say. Okay? And essentially, most non-Muslim scholars will agree that our account is more or less correct. And I've just put up a disclaimer there so you know that I'm not trying to lead you in the wrong direction. Obviously, they don't accept that it's divine. Okay? But in terms of what we say, it was collected at the time of Muhammad, it was collected again at the time of Abu Bakr, it was collected again at the time of Uthman, they'll agree with that. In terms of our overall claim that the text hasn't changed during that period, they essentially agree with that. And I'll be giving you some quotes in just one moment. One of the major supporting arguments for this idea, and this is why the two latter arguments have recently been blown out of the water, is that the Islamic political climate was so tumultuous in the early period of Islam, after the death of the Prophet, that it is impossible for the text to have been altered and not contain at least some details about that. Okay, so for example, favouring one tribe over another, because the tribes were at a significant amount of war immediately after the death of the Prophet, vying for the Islamic presidency. And it was a conflict that went on for hundreds of years, basically, and didn't end until the Mongols came and conquered the Islamic Empire. So you can probably appreciate that if the Qur'an was fluid during this period, there would be some, political leanings introduced during that time, and there are none. Moreover, the manuscripts are essentially uniform. Okay, and what I mean by essentially uniform is that as far as the foundation goes, they are uniform. Okay, for those of you that don't know, Semitic languages, so Hebrew and Arabic are included in Semitic languages, have no written short vowels. Okay, they're later introductions to make recitation easier for non-native speakers. So the examples that we looked at with Samuel a little bit earlier are actually differences in short vowels that are far, far later introductions to the text and to the writing system. All right, in terms of the foundation of the text, the root words, there are no differences in any manuscript. And anywhere where there are manuscript differences, and I'll talk about one, they're corrected in antiquity. And in terms of the recitation differences, I'll probably be able to speak about that more in the rebuttal. So just very quickly, a couple of quotes from academics here. Wensborough's hypothesis of a very late crystallisation of the Qur'an text outside of Arabia is not in accord with the internal evidence of the text itself, which implies a very early crystallisation, i.e. before those civil wars I was just referring to. Okay, now that's from Fred Donner in 2006. The reference is there if you'd like to jot it down and check it for yourself. He's not a Muslim. Okay, this is what he's concluded about the Qur'an. He's a professor of Oriental and Semitic Studies at a university in the United States, I think Pittsburgh. Andrew Rippon has also said, in 1972, a treasure trove of ancient manuscripts of the Qur'an were discovered in Sana'a. Certainly the existence of the manuscripts indicates that the text, or at least extensive parts of it, were well in existence by the 8th century. So that means by 700, so roughly 50 years after the death of Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Qur'an was certainly in existence. Okay, again, a non-Muslim scholar. And the reference is there. What about the differences between the Hafs and Warsh recitation? Well, I'll just speak about them quickly. Both are verbal transmissions of the text, okay? Now, this again might be a bit hard for you to understand in a Christian context, but for those of you that do know at least Hebrew, you'll know that there's at least 3 different recitation methods in Hebrew for reading the Hebrew scriptures. Okay? That's basically what we're talking about here with the Qur'an. It doesn't change the root text. It's just changing the recitation method. It doesn't change the meaning. It just changes the recitation method. And I'll actually look at a couple of examples, but first of all, quoting Adrian Brockett, certain differences between the two transmissions, so he's speaking about Hafs and Warsh, and again the reference is there, at least in the copies consulted, occur consistently throughout. None of them has any effect on the meaning. And what does that mean? All this points to a remarkably unitary transmission in both oral form and written form. Okay, so basically here's another non-Muslim scholar concluding that our version of events is more or less correct. So let's look at some of these differences. Now, for those who are at the back, this might be a little bit hard, and I've put the English transliteration there for you. These are actually differences between the Hafs recitation and the Warsh recitation that are quoted on a website that I know Samuel's contributed to called Answering Muslims. And here there's a couple of differences. Now, you can see that, well, from the way we look at it, that there are consonantal differences, differences in consonants. And you're probably thinking, well, hang on, he just told me that there's only short vowel differences. Well, I'm not going to speak about the short vowel differences. I want to give you some consonant differences so you know that I'm really not trying to pull your leg. The thing that I really want to hammer home is, first of all, for those of you, I hope everyone can see it, the dots above and below the Arabic letters do not exist in the original Arabic written form. Okay, so when the Qur'an was first written down, these dots above and below the Arabic letters did not exist. Now, these dots aren't short vowels, they're consonant markers. Okay, consonant markers. So, for those of you that don't know, Arabic's read right to left. So, in the first two boxes we've got over here, you'll see that the first word begins as a sort of a U shape with two dots at the bottom. That means ya, okay, or a Y, okay? On the corresponding word in the different recitation method, it begins with two dots at the top of that U shape. That means ta. Okay, now you think, well, hang on, that's a different consonant. Surely that changes the meaning of the word. It doesn't, because the root of this word here is about to speak. Okay, it just changes the tense of the word. It doesn't change the meaning of the overall sentence. Okay, going down, we've got another consonantal difference. Okay, again you can see with dots, the consonantal difference is regarding the fourth letter. Okay, it sort of looks like an upside down R. All right. In that instance, it actually does correspond to an R. Right, in the second one over, with the dot at the top of it, it means a Z. Okay, so we've got in, using the Latin transliteration, the words nunshizuha and nunshiruha. Okay, now these words actually have different specific meanings individually. One says to cover, or one means to cover, one means to propagate. Okay, but in the sentence in the Qur'an, it's referring to covering the bones of an animal with flesh. Okay, so one's saying cover the bones with flesh, the other one's saying put flesh all over the bones. Okay, so hopefully you can at least get a bit of a rough idea that these differences in meaning in the individual words don't change the sentence itself, and it kind of indicates that given that these dots didn't exist in the first sort of century or so of the Qur'an, that somehow the meaning was maintained without even the consonants being specifically maintained. So going on. The key issue here, but, is, as I said, there's no difference in the root of the text. Now we call that the rasm, the root of the text. Okay, so that's all these Arabic words without the dots. Okay, and without the short vowels. There's no difference there. So I'm sure that you can at least appreciate that graphically, from up the back even, the words in the two boxes there that correspond to one another look very similar. That's all that you really need to appreciate from that. So, was the Qur'an ever written like this without dots? Well, certainly it was. Here up on the left-hand side, I've got a very early manuscript, and again, this is going to be very hard for the people up the back to see, so many apologies, with no dots. Okay, no dots for the consonants, and no short vowel markers. And these additions to Arabic came over time. So here we've got a later manuscript. It comes about 100 years or so later. And again, it's going to be very difficult for you to see up the back, but there are red dots starting to appear resembling, meaning short vowels, and black dots for consonants. Okay? Now, this isn't the modern method that's used for writing. Okay? But that's not the issue that we're discussing here. We want to discuss whether the foundation of the text has been maintained, and certainly the manuscript evidence is that it has. Now, if you'd like to look at some manuscripts yourself, again, I'll have references up towards the end, and you'll be able to then take a look on the internet. One myth that's often propagated is that we don't allow